team. We're working with his team. So a little bit of the background on the meeting. It is being recorded, and it will be posted on the meetings portal, and you'll have a couple chances to see what that address is. Our goal is to do a 60-minute presentation and then answer a bunch of questions and have some good discussion, hopefully. So as we go through, feel free to enter your questions in the chat box, and those will receive the priority. And then after that, we'll go over just what you need to do to raise your hand icon, and then the moderator will pick people out by priority, and each speaker will be given 3 minutes. And here on the screen, you'll see some background information for me. Feel free to call me or email me with any questions that you may have that come up. Here's just a presentation outline for this evening, and I'll just mention the people that we have participating in addition to myself. We have Sarah Compa and Bill Moon from Tribal Architects. They've been long involved with the project and are currently partnered up with SKB, our master development partner. We have John Olivier from SKB. He's the Senior Vice President of Development and Acquisition. And then here, probably we'll have some questions involving zoning later on. We have John Boberell, Senior Planner for the city, who's been really quarterbacking the current rezoning effort. And Nancy Fenton, who's our department administrator, will help coordinate the question and answer period. And here's just some of the highlights that we'll hit as we go through the presentation. So here's an aerial overview of CityCenter. You know, it comprises 55 acres right there at a key intersection of Hampton and Santa Fe, as well as Broadway. Really a major crossroads in the Denver area. Just starting with the aerial. Then just by way of background, quick background, as Brad mentioned, CityCenter was the former location of Cinderella City, which was, it had a great heyday, which lasted, 30 years or so, and then was replaced, and the replacement CityCenter opened in 2000, and it was completed in 2003. It went hand in hand with the redevelopment or the opening of the Southwest Light Rail Extension. It was the first transit-oriented development, or TOD, in our region. It came along with 1 million square feet of development, just over 400 residential units. The city offices are here, of course. There's also the City Library and Museum of Outdoor Arts. It was the home to lots of really big box retail, big box and junior box retail, including Walmart, Ross, Office Depot, Petco, and to the south of CityCenter's Sports Authority, as well as a good portion of small format retail and office along Inglewood Parkway. We'll talk about the fact that it's also home to a park and ride for RTD that provides over 900 spaces, and there's some really nice special features, the public plaza, fountain, and sculptures. And here you'll hear us talk about what we refer to as the city property, which is this property in blue. It's controlled by the city or owned by the city. And then also the former Weingarten property, which is the property that was developed and operated for many years by Weingarten Realty. And it was foreclosed on in 2018. And it was really that foreclosure that opened the door to the redevelopment opportunities and the opportunity for the city to kind of coordinate a redevelopment that covered a total of 22 acres. So just a little bit under half of the original acreage of CityCenter. The property opened, which with much ado, national awards. Many people thought it was the greatest thing that had ever happened in terms of transit-oriented mixed-use development. And then over the past 20 years, things have changed. And so we are now reacting to those changes in terms of the redevelopment of CityCenter. So just to highlight a couple points, what did change? Certainly the continuing trend towards online retailing has had a major impact on the retail that was really a key part of the original CityCenter development. As things progressed, there wasn't enough density or mix of uses to keep CityCenter viable as an attractive urban setting sense of place, which is what consumers are looking for today. And then one of the big things that happened is many people copied CityCenter, and so there emerged many TOD locations, both locally and nationally, so lots of competition. As I mentioned, the former Weingarten Realty property was foreclosed on in 2018. That created a lot of additional turmoil in CityCenter. Long-term vacancies continue to increase. 24-Hour Fitness vacated in the spring of 2020. Office Depot closed earlier this year in April. Of course, adding to all that, COVID had a major impact on the health and welfare of many tenants at CityCenter. And then the other thing that's happening, just to set the stage, is the two big older retail centers to the east of CityCenter, Inglewood Marketplace and Inglewood Plaza, have their tenants have experienced the big challenges caused by COVID and the changes in the retail market. And so we expect to see some additional vacancies there in the near future. So this leads us to why redevelop? And it becomes pretty obvious, you know, what we're trying to accomplish is to reverse the negative impacts of a downward trending, dated, low density retail focused center. We do want to add hotel, office, residential uses, and quite a bit more density to an underdeveloped area that's really lost its appeal and its financial sustainability. One of the great opportunities we have is to use CityCenter to revitalize the entire downtown area in tandem with the new Inglewood Downtown Development Authority and all the work they're doing as a champion of downtown. We believe redeveloped CityCenter can increase sales and property taxes and generate other revenues for the city, because the city right now effectively receives no current revenues for the value of its significant real estate interests at CityCenter. And in general, we really want to use CityCenter as an anchor to retain and attract Inglewood employers, residents, downtown retailers, restaurants, etc. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah for some background from Tribal Architects.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan mentioned earlier, you know, when Cinderella City was redeveloped as the region's first TOD redevelopment, it was at the leading edge and the forefront of transit-oriented development for the Denver region. And Cinderella City, when it was developed, was at the leading edge of you know, kind of a regional mall attraction for great retail and as a community hub. So in keeping those two pieces of information in mind, we think that the next iteration of CityCenter has the ability to also kind of lead the way in how to successfully redevelop an aging TOD site and bring it into the, you know, into modern times and adjust to the surrounding context and the pressures that Dan just outlined. So this is a little spread about, you know, from Cinderella City through the early 2000s, and a newspaper article there on the right about what was coming. The iconic bridge structure and the connection to the rail and the station itself, and then a vision for what, you know, what density and what retail could bring to the site. As Dan outlined, that didn't quite come to pass or has slowly faded over time, given the challenges that retail faces today. So with that in mind, you know, a little bit about what is transit-oriented development. It focuses new development or additional supplemental development around rail, or in some cases bus rapid transit, but a very high ridership and regionally connected station. And so Englewood certainly has that. It's had that since 2000. It can catalyze more neighborhood investment, more business investment, and it supports a range of uses. And transit-oriented development also takes a certain density in order to support all of those uses. So just as a grocery store wouldn't go into a community without the number of households to support it, transit-oriented development requires enough office workers, residents, and businesses to create that vibrancy and energy and people. We like to think cities can be cities and towns and certainly TOD sites can be 12-hour places or even 18-hour places. Manhattan might be a 24-hour place, but Englewood has the opportunity to be a 12 or a 16 or an 18-hour place where someone might stop at a shop on their way to the station at 7 a.m., grab a cup of coffee. On their way home, they might meet someone, at a local watering spot and get a bite to eat, meet up with friends to watch a game. So it really stretches the time when business can be done and when people are active around the site. So Englewood, it is one of many transit-oriented development sites in the region. We did a significant study on a lot of the surrounding station areas and highlighted a few for today's presentation. So we'll talk briefly about Alameda, Broadway, and then Bellevue. Alameda and Broadway Station being north of Englewood on the C and D lines headed towards downtown Denver, and then Bellevue Station off to the east along the I-25 corridor. So Alameda Station, for those that don't know the site too well, immediately adjacent to the station itself, it has redeveloped. There are now 3 multifamily parcels either in development or fully developed. The middle image on the right is the Denison that's been fully built now and open, I think, for about 6 years, with a little bit of retail at the base. And then 2 additional multifamily buildings are opening basically due north of where it says Alameda Station, kind of at the corner of Alameda and Cherokee Streets. So it's seen significant reinvestment, not dissimilar to Englewood. It has some complicated lease structures for the existing retail that has, kind of slowed what might have been a faster redevelopment. Broadway Station, just south of Alameda Station, is an important station because it is the connector for a number of different lines where the I-25 corridor and the Santa Fe corridor come together. It's also known as the former Gates rubber plant. So some of the remediation issues on site there have taken some significant time to work through. But we hear that the latest plans and the latest developer are well on their way, and you see some images on the right of what that development might look like, including on the bottom right there, a green space connected across the tracks, across the heavy rail tracks over to the Platte River. Bellevue Station further east. So this is actually technically in the city of Denver, but right there on the boundary with the Denver Tech Center, just north of Bellevue. And if anyone's been over there recently, so Newport Street is the north-south street that runs just west of Quebec. And there's a number of multifamily residential developments there, a number of successful restaurants, both local and national restaurants that have come in. And slowly over time, the adjacent parcels are redeveloping. The key here, I think they're including hotel, office, and multifamily residential to have that vibrant mix of uses and people on site at all times.
Thanks, Sarah. it really becomes clear when you look at all these other TOD projects in the Denver area. And as Sarah mentioned, Triba has documented them in great detail. You know, it really sets the context for what we need to do at CityCenter in terms of achieving the mix of uses and density that you'll see kind of built into the planning effort. So one of the things I do want to talk about is there are two big redevelopment strategies for CityCenter. And the first one is the master developer role. As I mentioned, the Weingarten property in red was foreclosed on in August. That was somewhat of a surprise. They are a well-known retail developer and operator. So this big property was foreclosed on, and it was foreclosed on by a group of bondholders who are now represented by an entity called LNR Partners. So one of the things in our discussions with City Council that emerged was the idea of the city going to the marketplace and selecting a master developer to represent its interests in blue to really kind of counterbalance whatever might happen with the Weingarten property, both defensively and offensively, you might say, or proactively, to look for redevelopment opportunities that would involve both properties, because that was really the vision of City Council, is to do a bigger redevelopment rather than a piecemeal approach. And so taking City Council's direction, the Community Development Department went out and orchestrated a competitive master developer selection process for the blue property. The process lasted over a year. It had various steps. It had an RFQ, request for qualifications, request for proposals, a wide variety of interviews with the city departments, ultimately with City Council. And through all of that, by virtue of all that, SKB was selected as the city's preferred master developer. And so we went to originally an exclusive negotiating agreement, and that evolved into a preliminary development agreement with SKB that was approved by council last year on June 1 of 2020. It was extended this year on April 19th through the end of this year. And that was largely due to, as you might imagine, the impacts of COVID on all of the redevelopment planning that our respective teams were involved with. And our goal at this point, and you'll see our progress towards it, is to really come up with a redevelopment plan and have that as the basis of a master development agreement between the city and SKB going forward. And we really envision this relationship as a long-term partner-like relationship. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Olivier to provide some background on just who SKB is. John?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, so I'm John Olivier. I'm Senior Vice President of Development and Acquisitions for SKB. We're really pleased to be partnering with the city and Triba to bring this redevelopment to the forefront. And, you know, many of you may not know who SKB is. We have been in the Denver market for quite some time, but we are a real estate investment and development firm. We have been around since 1993. And we've really been focused on 5 major markets on the West Coast. That includes Portland, Oregon, which is our home base, Denver, Phoenix, the Bay Area, and Seattle. We currently have a portfolio that includes about 5 million square feet of a variety of product types. It includes mixed use, suburban mixed use, retail, office, hospitality, industrial, and retail, as well as multifamily. Total transactions to date since our inception, we've transacted on just shy of about 30 million square feet of real estate. And through that, over this period of time, we've developed quite a few relationships with not only institutional capital partners, but lenders and the like. And Dan, if you can fast forward there, thanks. We have been really heavily focused in the Denver and Portland markets over the last 5 years or so. We have owned some assets in Denver. One of our most recent acquisitions in Denver is the what we call York Street Yards. That's the new name of the project. It's about 450,000 square feet of industrial. It's an old Army surplus depot that's located just east of Denver, just outside of the Rhino Arts District. And we've been converting that, those buildings into a more dynamic mix of industrial, light manufacturing, and retail-oriented spaces. But we have had a number of other investments in the Denver market. We probably right now, Denver, outside of our presence in Portland, Denver is probably the largest of our markets. What we really like to focus on is finding the next great neighborhood. Really looking at where the path of growth is and where we see that there is a real potential that just hasn't quite taken hold yet, which is one of the reasons why we're so excited to be working on the CityCenter property with the city of Inglewood. It's got all of the right, really all of the right, I guess, bones, for lack of a better term, in terms of the makings of a great neighborhood. And so we're really excited to continue to work with the city to execute on the project. As I mentioned before, we have experience both with development as well as redevelopment. In our portfolio, we have done everything from buying existing buildings to ground up development. And that combination of experience, we think, really helps in the redevelopment process, because we really understand and can approach the planning, the design, and then obviously the construction of the project from an ownership perspective, with the idea that we will continue to be involved in the project long after the various buildings are built. And I think, Dan, yes, sorry, forgot about this one. So we have had quite a focus on transit-oriented communities and transit-oriented projects. A couple of the projects you see here, the Round in Beaverton is a mixed-use project, is actually built very similar to what you see there at CityCenter. It's right, in fact, the light rail runs right through the middle of the project. The project is actually built around a light rail stop. It is a circular development, at least in the center of the development, and the light rail runs right through the middle of that, hence the name The Round. But many of our projects, both in Portland and elsewhere, have been focused on the light rail orientation. And we feel that this experience, this kind of, again, real world ownership experience in that context, coupled with Triba's, Triba's knowledge of what makes a great TOD development from a planning and design perspective, their past experience in executing similar projects, we think that the combination between our two companies will work really well, and so far it has. Dan, do we have any more here?
Thank you, John. That was great. I think it really underscores what a great selection SKB was. I mean, the city departments, the city council was really happy with that selection process and all of the qualifications that SKB brings to the table. Of course, just about the time that we were finalizing our preliminary development agreement, COVID hit. And so that really slowed things down in 2020, as you might expect, while the markets were adjusting and trying to figure things out. But we had a great team member on board, and so we figured out how to move forward together. And as I mentioned, in April of this year, extended the preliminary development agreement through the end of this year. The second big key strategy piece for us is what we refer to as the framework agreement with L&R Partners. And I mentioned they represent the bondholders who had foreclosed on the former Weingarten property, which is colored in red here, and it's also labeled as parcels C, D, and BB. So what happened is that as a follow-up to L&R taking over representing the bondholders, and then the impact of COVID, which in some ways was a blessing because it prevented L&R from being able to just sell the property in an as-is form, which is really and I'll show you in a second here, would have been really detrimental. So in October of last year, City Council authorized staff to begin negotiating a framework agreement between the city and L&R Partners. And that agreement was really intended to position a significant portion of their property, the former Weingarten property, for redevelopment rather than sale as is. So the three key portions of the framework agreement, which is now up for City Council consideration finally next month on August 16th. I think it'll be up for their approval. The three pieces are a termination of the underlying ground lease. All of the red property sits on top of a 75-year ground lease. There's now just 54 years left on that. So what we've talked about is really the trade-off being a termination of the ground lease, which will then facilitate redevelopment of that property, or at least major portions of it. We also have agreed that for everyone's benefit, it was really best to rezone the CityCenter property from its original PUD zoning back to what it originally was, and back to what is the mixed use downtown zoning, and it's called MUB1. And then there was also a portion of this agreement in principle where council agreed on a preliminary basis to endorse a 350 plus or minus multi-unit residential project on the south half of what we refer to as Block C, and that's where Office Depot and Harbor Freight are located. And what this framework agreement really allows to happen is it allows the City Council's original desire and vision for the city property and for the former Weingarten property to be developed redeveloped in a coordinated fashion. So basically the agreement, and these are hypothetical, but they are kind of the goal, if you will, of the framework agreement. On what's labeled here as parcel B, which is in the lower left-hand corner, the 24-hour fitness and Tokyo Joe's buildings would be conveyed to a transferee selected by L&R with the input and approval by the city. We all hope that that will be SKB. And so then that helps really consolidate the holdings on parcel B. And without that consolidation, the redevelopment of parcel B becomes very, very challenging, perhaps even impossible. So this was a big way to resolve that problem. Also, that plaza adjacent retail that's labeled as BB was identified also on a preliminary basis for sale to SKB. And that really supports SKB's redevelopment plans, as you'll see a bit later, in terms of redeveloping that area, reactivating it in a way that it never has been, and addressing a significant challenge there. And then the other thing that's contemplated is a sale of the north half of parcel C to a selected transferee, again with city approval and input, and hope to be SKB. And then finally, parcel D would be held by a longtime buyer, but any buyer who had redevelopment ideas would have to enter into some discussions with the city as part of the upfront sale that essentially outlined what the long-term redevelopment plan for that property would start to look like. And that is the property that contains the long-term leases with Ross and with Petco. One of the things the city gained in this context was the right to negotiate a developer covenant with each transferee of the former Weingarten property, and particularly, as I mentioned, the parcel D. And so I just want to highlight here, without the framework agreement, L&R would have leased up the current vacancies and then sold the property as is. The new leases would have taken the property out of play for redevelopment for probably somewhere between 10 and 25 years. And under the original terms of the ground lease, the city would have had very little control over the property during that time. So there would have been very little opportunity to actually engage in this idea of a larger redevelopment and a better density and a better mix of uses. And then I'll also just mention that as currently operated, the city received no annual value for the ground lease, since that was all prepaid up front, a very nominal prepayment of $4 million. And again, so one of the things we're trying to also achieve is a much, much greater level of control for the city over this 54-year period. And with that, I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Dan. So we'll dive into a little bit of the current site plan, and then we'll show what a conceptual redevelopment plan might look like. But to start, just to get everyone oriented here, so Civic Center building, the kind of 45-degree angle there in the lower left, right up against the C&D line on the RTD line. Above that, to the north, is the parking garage and the multifamily residential building. That's what in the architecture world we call stick frame. So it's a wood frame construction. And again, back in 2000, that was kind of very at the forefront of transit-oriented development in Denver. It was pretty dense for TOD development in Denver. Fast forward to today, and that is a pretty low density space. The residential immediately to the east of that is also very low density, a lot of surface parking there. And so just those residential buildings alone don't foster enough activity and foot traffic for the retailers along Englewood Parkway, and certainly not there immediately adjacent to the station, which is why a lot of those retailers, why a lot of that retail there has failed over time. The red line kind of outlines the city center boundary, and you can see Walmart is included in that. That's definitely not going anywhere anytime soon. Walmart is known for their long, kind of long-term holds on property, and even into surrounding property, having rights there with views to their signage, et cetera. So we focused our kind of our efforts on the western half between Galapago and the rail line. So we'll just touch briefly on the current Civic Center building itself. This was originally built as a department store, and department stores, they were built not unlike casinos. They were built not to have access to daylight and to have, really large floor plates for a reason, so that you would go inside and kind of disappear, and kind of lose yourself in the shopping experience. That doesn't necessarily translate that well to an office building. They're really, really deep floor plates. I have the next slide, we'll go into that, but this center picture here, that kind of monumental stair that leads you between the first, second, and third levels really highlights how dark it is on the interior. It also means that it's really inefficient. But before we go to the inside, the exterior of the building, that because it was such a large floor plate, it was designed not to have any windows. And so during this adaptive reuse into the Civic Center building, the structural engineering, we got as many windows in there as we could, because the exterior walls are actually structurally part of the structure of the building itself. So the idea of punching more windows in it today to reuse it in a different way would be really challenging, both structurally and then also from a cost perspective. We'll move on, Dan. So inside the building, the program that was put into the building almost 20 years ago now, the library, the courts, a number of the offices, a lot of that program has changed too. Libraries today function a lot differently than they did 20 years ago. They provide very different services. They certainly provide similar services today, but you wouldn't design a library today in the same way that you did 20 years ago. Similar to the courts, and the staffing and office space use that the city currently uses, staffing has changed as well. I'll draw your eye to the plan on the upper right. So a couple things stand out looking at this today. One is that it's 200 feet by 250 feet. And a typical office building might be 200 feet by 100, maybe 130 feet, 200 or 250 feet long. So this means that more people in a narrower building, you have more access to daylight. And you can see that if you are the unlucky person to sit in one of the inner cubicles, how far away you could be 100 feet from the nearest window, which is unhealthy, not recommended, certainly not today by today's standard. 50,000 square foot floor plates are also not the norm today. Your typical office building and even civic building might have a 30,000 square foot floor plate, so significantly larger what you're dealing with. The image on the upper left of the courts, you can see how, at the time, we did the best that we could with the building, but the columns that come right in the middle of the seating there certainly wouldn't be how you might design a courtroom or council chambers today. So at the time, it was adaptively reused as best as possible from a cost savings perspective, but not necessarily what you would do today. So future vision, again, this is very conceptual, could change in a number of different ways, but just high level, I'll call your eye to the fact that there would be a lot of different uses. So right now, the yellow that we're showing is representative of multifamily housing, up to likely 5 to 6 stories. The purple could be a hotel, so right there at the intersection of Englewood Parkway and Inca. The blue would be office, and orange might be senior housing. One thing to note here is that the parking garage that currently serves Civic Center and some RTD parking has been distributed among a lot of different garages that are integrated into those buildings. They would be wrapped by certain uses so that if, as a pedestrian, kind of walking along those new streets, that you wouldn't be, kind of overwhelmed by a parking garage in a way that you are right now, just to the west of the parking garage there, or just to the east of the station, rather, kind of near the bus terminals and the bus waiting areas. Englewood Parkway, just west of Inca, would serve as kind of a plaza. You could close it off during certain events, whether it's a food truck festival, might be, kind of a winter holiday market or farmers market, arts fair, you name it. So that zone could be closed off and function like a plaza, but during normal times, it would be kind of limited traffic. You would feel like you were kind of driving through a plaza though, so it's a different paving texture. It feels more elevated and special. What that does though, in a way that that it doesn't do today, is it allows the opportunity for just a little bit of vehicular traffic to come by those retail units, both new retail under the new residential buildings, but also the retail that exists today and would be repurposed on the north side of that plaza. That retail has never survived. It just doesn't have the foot traffic and the draw. But by having a hotel kind of anchoring one end of that plaza and the station anchoring the other, with additional residents, office users kind of filtering through there, it gives you the ability to support more than just a coffee shop, and Nixon's does so well, and really anchors that corner. But it could start to support more things, more 18-hour uses, in addition to the retailers that are there today. So just a couple of images on the right: farmers market, potentially a beer garden, whether seasonal or permanent, but lots of people. We also think, there's a way to pay tribute to Cinderella City in some of the new smaller streets that are that might be in the development. You might name one of the streets Cinder Alley, or we kind of making reference to Cinderella City's heyday in the past. Could also incorporate it into some of the directional signage, some historic kind of signage throughout the site to give people an idea of what was. And then just really quickly, the active public spaces. So the public realm can almost be more important than the buildings themselves. And the buildings need to be great buildings, but in the background of what is the public experience. So whether you're designing spaces for children with the pop jets, a place to, on your lunch break, enjoy some shade in the 95-degree summer heat, to have your lunch, getting a drink or dinner with friends or family after work or on the weekends. So that public realm is really important, and a high quality public realm, great lighting, great landscaping, great streetscaping to really amplify what is the great potential here in Englewood.
Thanks, Sarah. I think you really hit the nail on the head there, and we've all been to these types of places. We have a good number of them throughout Denver. How do we capture that for CityCenter, the center of Englewood, where a place where, not only our own residents want to come, but also people who can access CityCenter via light rail, via bus, want to come, want to hang out, want to spend time, spend money here, and also use this as a gateway to the rest of downtown. We have a great classical retail street in South Broadway. How do we feed more people into that area to enjoy it in combination with CityCenter? So one of the things I wanted to mention was, we've hit this point about our two big redevelopment strategies, that is partnering with a master developer, and then creating a win-win agreement with the representative of the former Weingarten property to position that property as a redevelopment play rather than an as-is sale. We do have 4 really important redevelopment keys in addition to those 2, and I'll just mention those because they are important. Number 1 is a reduction in the shared RTD parking at CityCenter. A lot of people don't realize it, but the city has an obligation to provide 910. Think about that, over 900 shared parking spaces to RTD. And as it turns out, all of those spaces are located on the property that's closest to the station, and that is the most valuable. So we are looking at a proposal, working very hard on an eventual proposal for RTD for why that number ought to be reduced. And as it's reduced, it will open up redevelopment opportunities at City Center. And when that comes about, we can, I think, also show how there's so much surplus parking at City Center that a reduction of a third, a half, even more in that parking will not make a material difference in the ability of many people to park here. Number two is a public finance tool. There will be a significant amount of public improvement infrastructure that needs to be undertaken to facilitate the redevelopment of City Center. One of the nice things that's happened is with our Inglewood Downtown Development Authority that was voted into existence last November, there's an opportunity to use bonding for those public improvements. But to be able to do that, one more election hurdle needs to be passed, and that's what's called a debt authorization. And we're hoping that that will come to voters in the EDDA in November of this year. And it's just for the qualified electors within that district. And there are only about 1,500 that are property owners, business owners, and a few residential tenants. The third item, and it may be more important actually than the public financing, is the role of the DDA as a champion of downtown Inglewood. Downtown really hasn't had a champion in many, many years. They haven't had an entity to brand, market, and promote downtown and better connect and integrate City Center, South Broadway, and the Wellness District. And I'll show you those three areas momentarily. Finally is the rezoning that we mentioned. That's a key part of the redevelopment framework and a key part of the agreements with both LNR and with SKB. Here's a quick overview of the, what the DDA is working on. I would say a key part of its mission is to connect, as I mentioned, these three sub areas, City Center, South Broadway, and what we're referring to as the Wellness District, which is where Craig and Swedish both occupy major portions of that area. So it's well underway. They've accomplished some great things since their board was seated just 3 months ago now. The EDDA received, I'll mention, the Governor's Award for Best Downtown Planning in Colorado that was awarded through Downtown Colorado, Inc. And recently, through the efforts of their executive director, Hillary Portel, they were awarded a $150,000 Main Streets grant from CDOT, and that'll be used to improve the South Broadway paseos and connecting crosswalk. So an immediate impact on downtown. And then just an overview of the rezoning. The rezoning really looked at basically two areas. The area in yellow, which is approximately the quarter mile from Inglewood Station, and then the area in coral, which represents an area between a quarter mile and a half mile. But the two areas, the two zoning areas are not these radius lines, but the specific area, blocked areas that are colored out. And so a rezoning approach was designed to deal with each of these areas in terms of their proximity to the station. And the rezoning looked at about 5 basic elements: uses, heights, densities, and what we'll cover on the next page. But in terms of uses, the rezoning will add hotel uses to the MUB1 zoning category. It's not currently included. That will help us, we believe, attract 1, perhaps 2 hotels ultimately to City Center. The ground floor retail in the City Center area will not be required. We think as a natural market demand, it'll be there. We expect to contract for a certain amount of it, but not require all of those big ground floor, first floor spaces to be retail. So retail really be confined as far as first floor spaces to the 3,300, 3,400, and 3,500 South Broadway blocks of downtown. In terms of heights, the rezoning moves the maximum from 100 feet currently to 125 feet, which is the same as the Wells Fargo building. Taller heights within the quarter-mile area, that yellow area, can be negotiated under the TSA overlay provisions. Densities are moved up, and 75 units per acre is established as a minimum. Maximum densities of 125 units per acre are established. And then again, within the close-in TOD, transit-oriented quarter-mile area, higher densities can be negotiated. Parking, the rezoning would reduce minimum residential parking from 1.5 to 1.0 spaces per unit in the half-mile area, and from 1.5 to 0.75 spaces in the quarter-mile area. Likewise, there's comparable reductions in parking for office, retail, hotel, and restaurant. And John and the planning group looked very closely at parking around the metro area, and our parking at CityCenter was very, very heavy, especially in light of this big pool of surplus parking that we have to work with. So we really weren't taking advantage from an efficiency and cost perspective of the big pool of parking that we do have. And then importantly, number 5, it was really to create this TSA, transit station area overlay district, that allowed the city staff, city departments, greater flexibility to negotiate the proposed site plans with developers without every project being burdened with the time constraints of going back to city council. So essentially, it's envisioned that building heights, residential densities, and parking requirements can be negotiated with each vertical developer, with significant input from a design advisory committee. And it's anticipated that that committee would be made up of one representative from Planning and Zoning Commission, one representative from City Council, then as well as a staff member, and that their evaluation effort on each vertical project would be guided by a design professional. And I think creatively, it's been proposed that the Planning Commission and City Council membership on the advisory committee would rotate. And so that'd be a really good way to keep those two bodies informed on a constant basis what's going on in terms of new projects. And so with that, we've reached the end of our presentation. Here's a recap of kind of the background we established at the beginning in terms of the recording. And if you have questions and haven't done so, feel free to put those in on the chat box. Nancy will help us get to those questions. And then when we're done with that, if time allows, happy to take additional comments just by raising your hand via the icon. And so with that, we'll turn to Nancy and try to take on some questions.
Okay, so we actually had a comment from Judith, and she'd be interested in a morning presentation for those who do not work a day shift. So for questions, we've received 2 questions on the same subject. Where are you planning to relocate everything that is currently in the Civic Center building?
Good question. Let me flip back here to the site plan, if I can get to it. Yeah, and that's a good comment on the timing. You know, we are anticipating another one of these briefing meetings as we proceed through the year, at least one, perhaps 2, and we'll look at the idea of doing them different times of day and perhaps in partnership with a couple other entities. And so we'll address that. If you look at on this map of the current site plan, the Civic Center building and its associated parking garage, the way they sit on that block, what we refer to as block B, is very awkward, and they take up the maximum amount of space. So it really prohibits to a great degree the development of what is very, very valuable land. And so one of the things we are looking at with SKB is ways of distributing, the uses of the Civic Center building in other more cost-effective ways, and also in ways that could be very activating for challenging areas of the overall project. So of course we have the public library. We'll also have the Museum of Outdoor Arts, two great cultural uses that are somewhat underappreciated, if you will, because of the fact that they're buried in this huge floor plate building that Sarah talked about. So we've had preliminary discussions about trying to break those uses out and see where they might go elsewhere in City Center, and perhaps be very activating for, for the adjacent space. We've looked at, and SKB continues to look at, several possibilities for the city offices. Again, they take up, because of the layout of the building, a very inefficient layout. And so there's a thought that we might be able to come up with a much more efficient layout that's much more cost effective in the long run, and that would free up the tremendous opportunity cost of the city offices being in this building and city employees continuing to park alongside of RTD riders in that big odd-shaped parking structure. So that's a really good point, but we think there's a great opportunity to distribute those uses in ways that really drive a lot more activity and efficiency within the redeveloped city center.
Yeah, just to add on that, Dan, we've talked about having the Museum of Outdoor Arts as almost kind of in line with with some of the retail along Englewood Parkway. So anchoring some of the retail, especially on the north side of the current plaza, where that has always been a little bit of a dead space, that could be expanded a little bit. Museum of Outdoor Arts might go in there, kind of towards the west end. Library uses today, they tend to be smaller with a library network distribution center for the actual books. So whereas you might be coming in to pick up books, browse a limited amount, not kind of a grand amount in a grand central library, you might be, using it for email access. You might be using it to take some online courses. So again, the program for libraries are different, and they might actually serve the public better in more interesting ways, almost as a retailer on the main street. And there was another question I noticed, is there commercial and retail space in the redevelopment? Absolutely. The other plan that we showed was just showing the upper levels. So retail and commercial uses certainly on the ground floor, on Englewood Parkway, on the plaza, and to a lesser extent on the other streets as well.
Okay, the next question is, are you certain there is a demand for office space in the area?
That's a good question too. We're not certain. Ironically, we think that COVID long-term will push office demand out of downtown into smaller format locations. So we think there is opportunity to land office and office employers at City Center, but they're probably not our primary targeted use at this point. If they come along, certainly we try to accommodate them. And I should probably really let John Olivier talk about this, because their role as the master developer is really to adjust the priorities in terms of how they seek out the vertical developers for the different uses. So John, can you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail right on the head in terms of kind of what we're seeing in a lot of our markets right now as an interest for employers to relocate from a dense urban environment within a central business district like downtown Denver. We've seen it here in Portland. We've seen it in the Bay Area. And there's kind of a, what they like to say is kind of a flight to the burbs. People are looking to be working closer to home, to feel like they have a little more space to move about. And so, even before the pandemic, we were feeling like that, there is some demand out here. There is medical office out in this location, but part of our goal here in finding the right sweet spot for a dynamic, targeted, what we're targeting is an 18-hour mixed use district, is to really try to capture the interest of an employee base. I think Sarah was mentioning earlier that, with a grocery store, for example, they generally won't move into a trade area unless they feel like that they have the residents in the area to service the grocery store, and employers tend to migrate the same way. They look for where their employees want to be, and are there amenities, local neighborhood amenities that will make this a desirable location for our employees to work. And so as we think about the programming for CityCenter, it's again finding that sweet spot to not only create a great location for the residents of Inglewood, but also to make it a desirable location for employees to want to work, to provide for local amenities, neighborhood amenities, so that employers feel like that all of the employees' needs on a daytime basis are going to be fulfilled. So, restaurants, some shopping, just nice walkable streets, that sort of thing. So I think we're going to see the demand for office come from multiple areas, if you will. That said, I think we want to be realistic. We don't see this as being an office-intensive area, and part of that is too, we want to create this dynamic, a dynamic area that really allows for activity after an 8 to 5 daytime population, or an 8 to 6, or whatever it ends up being. We really want to see people on the streets at any number of hours of the day, and this acting more like a neighborhood. So that's probably a roundabout way of answering the question, but we do think that there is demand, and that is something that we're going to continue to explore to make sure that we're creating that right mix of uses to potentially include some office based on that demand.
All right, our next question, which Mr. Olivier, I believe, touched on a bit, is will the redevelopment include commercial retail spaces or only residential and hotel?
Sure, and I'll tackle that, and then Dan or Sarah, you guys feel free to chime in. So yes, we are really focused on creating an active ground floor space, and looking at a lot of the most successful transit-oriented developments in not only in Denver, but in other areas, and certainly based upon our experience in owning similar projects, creating that street level activity for that's really driven by retail. That's going to be really important. So we are trying to look at programming retail in all of the areas on the ground level that makes sense, and really looking to the upper levels for things like office and residential. And further to that point, in the hotel, I think one of the things that we're really looking to do with the potential hotel is to make sure that the ground floor, even of the hotel, is activated and may contain a you know, a restaurant and bar that's open to the general public that really invites folks that are not, that may not be staying at the hotel, but are just in the neighborhood or just happen to be in the area to come in and you know, have a bite to eat or grab something to drink. Dan or Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
You know, John, I might just add to that is this idea of mixing the uses together and what happens when you do that and how that creates other opportunities. And one of the things actually related to the office I'm thinking about is, you know, another TOD project that Tribal Architects was actually involved with, Colorado Center, landed 2 years ago, I guess now, Cigna as a major office tenant in a new building there. And they brought along with them a requirement for a food hall, a really cool food hall. And so that brings a lot of interest, a lot of other visitors to the area. And so I could see something, you know, like John was talking about. I think there's an opportunity for a large office employer, not super large, but like around that size, maybe 100,000 square feet plus or minus, who would just look at Inglewood as a great environment for their employees. And then if they could bring, you know, this additional type of use to support their employees that would also support, you know, the citizens of the community, I think it would be so great. And then we talk to the two hospitals all the time. Of course, they are looking for opportunities to have a hotel in Inglewood that would be available to their patient families and visitors. And, you know, both hospitals have additional training needs, office needs, et cetera. So we'd like to be able to integrate those types of, you know, demands across the downtown area, ultimately with an improved trolley as well. So it kind of all pieces together.
Yeah, and feeding into that 18-hour city, you know, a hotel and an office building actually make really great parking bedfellows because the office users use parking during the day. You know, employees would certainly also arrive via light rail. Or could, and then the hotel, for those that are parking to use the hotel, those users traditionally use that at night. So they make really good shares, and then certainly the RTD overflow parking in the evenings also available to serve that retail that might be, you know, evening restaurants and bars. The residential piece as well, you know, in a more dense environment, having residential units that look out onto Englewood Parkway, look out onto some of the side streets. It enhances safety, you know, it's eyes on the street. So you've got employees and people patronizing the retail shops during the day, out and about during the day. And then, you know, folks walking their dogs in the evenings and in the early mornings. So lots of people on site just adds to that sense of safety around. Yep, exactly.
Okay, we've received a few questions about low-income housing. So are there considerations being made for low-income housing or impacts of this development on existing and future lower-income residents?
Well, I'll start out at the macro level and just say that I think all across the metro area, there's an increased focus on what I would call affordable and workforce housing. And just achieving a more diversified housing base wherever housing is developed. So we see that continuing to grow as a concern just among the general public. Certainly at the city council level, it'll be discussed, but ultimately how that gets integrated into residential projects is really going to be largely up to the individual developers of those projects to come forward with ideas, and then the master developer, SKB, to, you know, have some ideas about how to seek out developers who would have that kind of diversified housing as part of their general culture or general goal. John?
Yeah, I think that's right. Dan, we are looking again, going back to your point earlier about the mix of uses and creating kind of that level of diversity, and so we are looking at how best to implement that, and whether that's maybe allocating really looking at a specific parcel and seeing if we can bring in a developer that really specializes in executing on affordable housing, or if that's some kind of mix between affordable and market rate. Those are things we're going to continue to explore, but it is on our radar screen. It's something that we do want to try to address.
So could you describe what's the best case scenario timeline for when development could potentially start?
John?
Yeah, so I think the current schedule, as we're looking at it, is working for, kind of a November time frame to have a set of kind of all of the documents and the approvals in front of City Council for essentially that kind of lay out the master developer kind of package of approvals. I think, and Dan, you may have to correct me, but I think is the thought that the rezoning would be done by about that time.
Correct. We're hoping that the rezoning can essentially be wrapped up sometime in September.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And so we would be looking then, following that November timeframe, to start really working on furthering the design that's more specific towards construction, towards the aspects of construction. And the other thing that I think is going to be important for us to really execute on the kind of plan that Sarah showed earlier is for this Tabor election and the DDA to go through, so that we really have the ability to implement a lot of the public infrastructure that needs to go in. And I think that would probably, all of the pieces to make that, to get that put in place, would probably be in place sometime by the middle part of next summer. And thereafter, I think you would start to see then shortly after that, some of the site work, and then vertical construction would follow after that.
All right, so we have about 3 questions by the same person. All the pictures that you've included in the presentation are large, mature trees, which look very inviting. Are there plans to plant big trees? And then could you confirm, did you say RTD parking is not using 910 spaces daily?
I'll take on the RTD, and then John can talk about the trees and landscaping. We have observed that the RTD utilization of their parking, what we refer to as their parking, it's really purely shared parking. It's both for users of the center as well as their passengers. But that it's gone down, that it was going down before COVID. We've had a number of parking counts that confirm that. Then of course with COVID, I mean, it's the utilization, even as we've seen, work resume largely, has been incredibly low. And so in the transit world, there's a real doubt about how the demand and the utilization of transit-oriented parking will actually come back, if it'll come back anywhere close to where it was, and if so, how many years that could take. So I think we have a general expectation that the demand for that parking will be much, much lower than it has been historically. We're going to raise some questions with RTD about the general equity, if you will, of having so much parking clustered at one station, particularly when the historic demand here was driven in part by the rate structure for the train. And so we think with some adjustments there that the long-term equilibrium RTD parking here at CityCenter should be much, much lower than 900 spaces. Where that ends up, it's hard to say, but it'll be less, and I think we'll still be able to satisfy the passenger demand for automobile parking.
And I can jump in on the tree side. John can jump in as well. Part of the success of any urban, kind of new urban open space and public realm is the fact that, you know, it needs to work day one. And you're right that certainly the landscaping as it grows up and matures is only going to make the place better. But that lower center image is the pop jets at Union Station. That, you know, the trees are relatively small compared to what they will be in 20 years. As the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree is 25 years ago, and the next best time is to plant it today. So it would start with planting, you know, as large of trees as we can, and planting the right species in the right place with the right solar orientation, working with landscape architects to ensure that what does go in on day one is what will survive in that urban environment, making sure it has the right root depth, the right soil volumes, the right type of soil for our climate. So getting it right, you know, as a good experience day one that will only get better with age is an important part of the design piece for us.
Sarah, if I could tag on to that as well. One of the things that CityCenter currently is maintained by the city of Inglewood, and it's really not programmed. So that's another piece that we're bringing to this is through a metro district and with SKB as well, really maintaining, and not just maintaining, but enhancing the placemaking and the seasonal plantings and the signage and the programming of the places as well. So we don't have to rely on city staff or Parks and Rec and the whims of a city budget to make this place thrive. This place will thrive with reinvigorated programming and true enhanced maintenance of the placemaking.
Okay, the next question is the parking along the south side of Inglewood Parkway part of Walmart? And is the long-term goal to create Inglewood Parkway as a pedestrian-oriented street connection with downtown Broadway?
John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, you bet. I'm happy to address that. So I just want to make sure I understand where on the south side of Inglewood Parkway, where Walmart is. So let's see. That would be, so basically it's those three lots there on the south side of Inglewood Parkway. I'm assuming that's what we're referring to right there. And the answer to that question is yes, those are, they are part of an easement, a parking easement that Walmart has. And your question is a good question, and it's something that we've been looking at for quite some time, and that is how do we extend the pedestrian experience and really make an enhanced streetscape flow further to the east there, to really extend that. I mean, in a perfect world, what we'd love to do is see whatever we start at CityCenter continue to extend all the way to Broadway to really create that connection. And the first challenge that we have is obviously Walmart. And so we have had a couple of preliminary conversations with Walmart to discuss what those options may be. I think the reality is that Walmart is going to be really focused on making sure that that number one, they have good visibility. They actually have a view corridor easement across all of those properties to the south, all the way to Hamden. And so they're going to want to make sure that folks can readily see them from Hamden, or frankly from any of the other streets. And then they're going to want to make sure that the vehicular circulation for their customers is as efficient as it can be. And so if we can come up with a plan to really allow a plan to enhance the streetscape, but they don't feel like that we're materially impeding on those critical features for their parking areas, then I think that we have a shot at making something happen there. But we have been really looking hard at how we can, even if Walmart is not willing to undertake a major change or reconfiguration to those areas, which my guess is they probably are not, but that is a conversation that we're going to continue to have. We're trying to think of some creative ways where we still make it an inviting streetscape, and for both vehicular traffic as well as bicycles and pedestrian traffic, so that you just don't feel like you're walking through a sea of parking through that area. And Sarah or Dan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
The thing I would add, John, is we mentioned, these two larger, older retail centers that have, for example, their anchor tenants today are Big Lots and Hobby Lobby. Both of those, for all the reasons that have impacted CityCenter, are likely to be redeveloped in the near future. And so the rezoning that John and the planning team have structured covers those properties in anticipation of that. So I think we will see that. And as we do, as redevelopment occurs on those properties, then we have the opportunity to really connect South Broadway, the historical downtown, to CityCenter. And so that stretch of, what we sometimes refer to as no man's land along Inglewood Parkway will really decrease in size and have much more activity along it. Also, we've really been encouraged that the general manager at Walmart participated heavily in the efforts to start up the Inglewood Downtown Development Authority. So we think he can be a real asset as things move forward. He's very eager about using those spaces to create community events.
Okay, we have 3 more questions before we end. The first one of those is, will the city be offering any type of incentive programs to attract high quality retailers or businesses?
I would say the easy answer is no. No, we are a small city with very limited financial resources, but we have a very proactive economic development program that's headed up by Darren Hollingsworth. It's here in the Community Development Department, very creative, very proactive. And so I think they will continue to, be on the lookout to attract those types of users. But I think just trying to set the stage and create a good environment for where those types of employers will want to come, I think that's really our main goal. One of the businesses we point to is a new business on South Broadway called Core Consulting, and it's primarily an engineering firm. They have upwards of 70 employees that they brought into a building that they purchased and renovated, and they couldn't be more happy with downtown Inglewood. And we expect to be able to attract more, small to mid-sized employers like that for not only South Broadway, but the CityCenter area too.
Next question, any space being planned for indoor-outdoor transitional community space adaptable to meetings, education, performing arts, music, and business enterprise development?
I would just say we have lots of creative discussions about how to accommodate those types of spaces. We talk often to the hospitals about their needs and about co-development opportunities on properties that they, control or own. So we're looking at that all the time. I can't say that we have anything specific today, but I think there's definitely a desire to create some large spaces that could serve those types of community needs. John?
Sorry, Dan, I was trying to get you off mute there. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we're, again, going back and trying to look and find an area to, to really support the community. And it is hard to create a space that's kind of a, meets all the needs, so for example, in the question, you talk about meetings, education, performing arts, music, and so forth. Each of those tend to have kind of separate needs and requirements. And so it is hard to find a one-stop shop, if you will, to fulfill that. But the point of your question is not lost, which is, all of those things really make for a robust neighborhood experience. And so and there are things that, quite frankly, really help to synergize the community. So we are definitely looking at ways to fulfill those things. So for example, I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. The hotel facility usually has quite a bit of dedicated meeting space that's open to the public. Now, usually they're charging for that. It's not a free amenity, but there are meeting spaces. And then the other things that you mentioned there in terms of performing arts, music, and so forth. In many of our other developments, it may not be a 100% dedicated space all of the time for that type of thing, but we are always looking at how to integrate those features into the development. So it could be that you have weekend concerts, or you have art walks during the year on a first Thursday or whatever you might see. So I think there are a lot of these, there are a lot of ways that we can tackle that. And we're looking at that not only from a programming perspective, but from an operational perspective as well.
Okay, our last question for the evening is Walmart working along with the city to improve their presence in the community? And also, how selective will the city be when it comes to selecting retailers that are a good fit for our community?
I would just say quickly that Walmart's been a pleasant surprise in terms of their participation in the Downtown Development Authority. I think they can continue to be a good partner as we engage them and they see what the plans are to build around them and bring more shoppers to their store, in effect. On the retail selectivity, I think that's really a big part of the master developer's role. And so we'd look to SKB to, make the right recommendations and selections to the city. Wouldn't that be your vision as well, John?
Yeah, that's right, Dan. Retailers, what you're always trying to do from a retail perspective is to make sure that you are bringing in retailers that complement one another. It's not going to be to anybody's benefit to bring in a retailer that's highly competitive with another retailer, or is really not creating the kind of synergy that you want. So it really, that's one that really comes down to an operational issue and just being focused on selecting the right retailers for the community that are going to generate a lot of business from the community, and are going to be complementary to one another as well.
That is all the questions we have this evening.
Thank you, Nancy. Nice job. Well, I think that concludes our presentation. Really good questions. And I think this was a great opportunity for the city to partner up with SKB and Triba and provide, an update on where we are right now. And we'll look forward to, taking this format forward and having greater detail as the year progresses. So with that, I think we'll look forward to seeing everybody in a couple of months.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks a lot, Sarah and Bill.
Yeah, nice job, everybody.
Thanks, John.